This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Over the last few years, several prominent public intellectuals have been claiming that this thing they call postmodernism is responsible for all the authoritarian and hysterical politics coming out of college campuses. And I've been claiming over and over again that A, these people haven't read any postmodernism, and B, that the connection between what we now call social justice or identity politics and postmodernism is tenuous at best. Finally, two of them have actually done the reading and agreed to be on my show. This is my interview with Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. So I am sitting at my computer in my house, unlike every other Unregistered episode, for reasons that I'm sure everyone knows. The problem with the pandemic, of course, is that we can't leave our homes, and that means I can't conduct interviews in person anymore, which I think is one of the things that makes Unregistered special. And it's one of the things I love about it. But the great thing is that I'm now geographically unconstrained, and I can talk to anyone, anywhere, almost at any time. So today on Unregistered, I am joined by James Lindsay, who is in Knoxville,
That's right,
Tennessee, and Helen Pluckrose, who is in England.
Yep.
Where in England are you?
I'm in East London.
East London, okay. And I am here to destroy them. We have been mortal enemies for years now, and this is the final moment. I've lured them into my lair, and within an hour, they will both be discredited, and no one will ever pay attention to them ever again.
thank God. I've been waiting for that.
You two have made a fatal error. No, as a matter of fact, it's a bit more nuanced than that. So I did have fairly negative opinions of the two of you in terms of your work on postmodernism until James approached me last summer in New York City, very surprisingly, after my debate on postmodernism at the Soho Forum. And he came up to me, and when you introduced yourself, I sort of shut down when you said who you were, because I knew who you were, because I was not a fan of a lot of the work that you and your other colleague Peter Boghossian had been doing, and I had kind of written you both off. But when James started talking to me, I was blown away that it turns out that he and I guess Helen too, have come to some similar conclusions about not just postmodernism and what it means, but in particular the connection, and this is the most important thing, I think what we're going to be talking about mostly, right? The connection between what is called postmodernism or postmodern philosophy and what is now being called social justice in particular on college campuses, but it's now being seen in the media and in electoral politics as well. What is the connection between postmodern theory, postmodern philosophy from France, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and the rest, and the stuff we're hearing coming out of college campuses over the last, especially 5 to 6 years, in regards to gender and race and identity in particular, right? Is that fair to say that is at least sort of what the three of us are very much concerned about here?
I think
yes,
so.
I think we all see that working in the same way, those links to be there, whether or not we agree on whether that's a good thing or what would improve it and how we need to improve it is a different matter.
Right. So I'm pretty sure that Helen is still you still have quite a negative take on postmodernism generally. Is that correct?
I do, although I would qualify that with saying if it is a speculative philosophy that people use in order to try and think outside the box, then I don't see so much of a problem with it. And particularly in art, this is neutral. It's if it gets applied to social engineering, when it isn't evidence-based and it isn't universal or individual, that's when there's a problem.
I agreed with every single word of that. So far so good, and I will not have to destroy you. Good.
I'm so glad.
and James, you see that also. I mean, that's how you and I think mostly what you and I talked about when you approached me.
Right. Yeah, that is actually almost word for word my view about the thing. I might even add that as far as, since you mentioned the French people, what passed as postmodern philosophy in France and what became postmodern philosophy in America don't quite match. And I think some of these identity theorists have a lot to do with that as well.
Right. So let me see if I can lay out the history of this sort of phenomenon, and you guys can chime in too, because you're, even better experts on this than I am, although I was right in the middle of it, having been teaching on college campuses all through that period up until just a couple of years ago. So I'd say roughly 4 to 5 years ago. Of course, these words and concepts had been floating around the academy for a couple of decades, but they became ubiquitous and dominant, I would say, in the last 4 to 5 years, at least in my experience on college campuses and universities, at least in the United States where I was teaching. And we can talk about exactly what that means. Is so sort of this social justice category, which is it's a terrible name. First of all, it doesn't make any sense in a lot of ways, and it doesn't really describe what's being said. But I'm sure a lot of viewers and listeners know what we're talking about. But we'll get into specifics. And in fact, James has written literally an encyclopedia of social justice discourse, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm working on it. Let's not give me too much credit. I'm about a fifth of the way through. But that said, there's like 150,000 words already available. So I started at Christmas. So, give me some breathing room.
Yeah.
But it's coming.
But that's, someone might make fun of that, but I don't. I mean, there is a very particular language, particular discourse, particular set of ideas, concepts, a worldview. It's identifiable, it's discrete. You don't find it outside of particular circles in society. And so I actually think it's worthy of an encyclopedia, just like any other particular culture or language, right? So I saw this thing that's become called social justice, and the activists who animate it, who we call social justice warriors, become dominant, not in numbers. And this is very important. And I want to say this to both of you. I don't know. I think you probably would agree with me, even though neither one of you have spent much time actually on college campuses, right?
Not in a while.
Which is not to discredit you at all. I'm just saying that what I experienced, and I'm talking about, I've taught at 6 different colleges and universities in the United States, all sort of at the elite level. The people we call social justice warriors, the ones who are angry and talking about these ideas and marching on presidents' offices demanding diversity and inclusion in all sorts of odd ways, I have never seen them constitute more than I would say 5% of the student body. But they become dominant in the discourse and in the culture of these institutions. That is for sure, in that everyone is aware of them, and everyone, or at least it seems to me, most people, and this includes the faculty in particular, are afraid of them. I have been in faculty meetings. These things would have made your stomachs turn. Faculty meetings of the entire faculty. This was Occidental College when I saw this happen. When one of the leaders of the sort of the rape hysteria of about 4 or 5 years ago, she got up and gave a presentation, which was the shoddiest social science I've ever seen. So presenting studies which, you know, claim to show that 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women on college campuses are raped. And she showed that, you know, many of the respondents to the survey said themselves that they were not raped or sexually assaulted, but that the authors of this study believed that they were. So they counted them as having been raped. And she put this in a PowerPoint on the board, and I saw a room, and this was what was so horrifying. I saw a room of about 200 PhDs, professors, half of whom were in the social sciences or humanities, and the other half of whom were in the hard sciences, who knew damn well that this was an absolutely horrible piece of evidence, not say a single word, not ask a single question. I saw meeting after meeting, and I've seen faculty. I don't blame, I'm not angry at 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds for any of this stuff, right? I mean, when I was, believe me, when I was in college, I wasn't quite that ridiculous, but I was pretty ridiculous in a lot of ways. And I would never want I would never want what I said and thought and did as a college student to represent who I am now. But what enrages me is when you see, especially tenured faculty with lifetime job appointments, say nothing in response to things that are absolute lunacy. And not only that, that led to, at Occidental, for instance, a freshman boy, an 18-year-old boy, being expelled for having sex with a woman, another freshman, and the college agreed consensually on both parts because both of them had been drinking. And it was not allowed at that time, I think it's still in the college code, or was considered to be sexual assault if there was any intoxication involved. And that kid's life basically was ruined. He was thrown out of college before it almost started. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think I've seen the survey that you were talking about and how it did those figures. And I think that the main criticism of that was the alcohol question, because if we asked men if they'd ever had sex while drinking, I think it would probably turn out that a larger number of men had been raped than women.
Oh, sure.
And I get very angry with that kind of disempowering thing. If the man and woman are drunk, then the woman has been assaulted because she's the one who doesn't have the agency. It kind of reinscribes these ideas it's supposed to challenge, that men are the ones with agency and dominance and women are just passive receptacles. It's infuriating.
It's infuriating for me. We agree entirely. To me, it's infuriating because it is anti-feminist. It is actually patriarchal. It assumes that, as you just were saying, as women have no agency. If they're both drinking, the man is at fault. Well, that's clearly, a double standard there. So that was to me, the beginning of this new culture wars. And this was in when did that start? I guess it was about 2013 when that started. And then I think it was about 2 years later was the beginning of a new, what I would call hysteria on college campuses concerning race. And this was when across the country, Black students were leading it, but it was students of all colors, and many, many faculty were leading these mass protests, shutting down the university, shouting down professors in the quad at Yale very famously, and all over the place. Every campus had this. At Occidental, they surrounded an administrative building, trapping people inside of there, including my partner at the time, and not letting them out, banging on the windows. They had to actually bring the police in. And the claims, why did they encircle the building and talk about and do this? Because they were making claims that the institution of Occidental College was institutionally racist, that there was constant racist harassment and violence directed at Black and brown students. And the evidence for this was absolutely zero that was presented. There was, the Occidental College has 2,000 students, 200 faculty. It's a liberal, pretty much every faculty member is either a liberal Democrat or a socialist. It was the most ridiculous thing ever. So, and that took on a life of its own for about 2 years. We know there was this hysteria on college campuses. Many college students at places like Oberlin in Ohio, which is the most left-wing liberal arts college probably, were claiming that the Ku Klux Klan was on campus. And the college did what? They shut down classes, and they had the faculty and the president apologize for the racial supremacy that was running rampant there. It turned out it was a girl who was afraid of being found out for having an affair, who was wearing a sheet over her head the morning after she slept with some boy. And this, again, these are not outliers. This was happening, as you all know, and many people know, all over the country. This is sort of old news at this point. I think most viewers will know this. I'm laying out the history here. Okay, so right around then, this is 2014, 2015, right around then, this guy named Jordan Peterson emerges. And Jordan Peterson begins, to me, heroically in his rise to fame, which was that there was a law passed, right, in Ontario that made it obligatory for, I suppose, in his case, professors in classrooms to use the chosen pronouns of the students, whatever they were. So if a student insisted on being called je or ex, he was legally obligated to use that pronoun in referring to them, and could actually face fines, and ultimately, if he refused to pay the fines, jail. I mean, he could actually go to jail. So he stood up against that and became very famous, and his rise to fame was actually meteoric. And at that point, I thought he was generally, on the right side, and I certainly supported that. I mean, that is, I have, very libertarian ideas about speech and academic freedom. I'm sort of an absolutist in those ways. But then, and this is where we're going to get into our discussion here, then Mr. Peterson began giving speech after speech after speech, angrily denouncing this thing he called postmodernism as the cause of all this very authoritarian social justice activism and thinking on college campuses. And at that point, I didn't know what planet I was on, because that did not comport in any way with what I had read and taught as a professor, because I had been teaching elements of postmodern theory for 2 decades at that point. I am not a philosopher. I have taught philosophy. I am not an expert on Derrida, but I have read Derrida. I have used Foucault and taught Foucault extensively for many, many years. And I've been around sort of postmodernist thinking in its classical form, which is a funny term, but in terms of the 1960s, the original postmodern thinkers, I have been around that kind of thinking for a long, long time. And what Jordan Peterson was saying about how they were responsible for the emergence of this social justice nonsense, this terror, really what it was a social justice reign of terror on college campuses. People were terrified of losing, of being thrown out, being expelled, faculty of losing their jobs, all of which has happened, by the way. And I was beside myself. I invited Jordan onto this show once. He said yes, and then he didn't follow up with times and dates. And then we asked him again. He said yes again, and once again he didn't follow up. And I feel like he was dodging it, and I feel like he was dodging me because it was clear to me that he had not read much, if anything, of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and the rest. And he was making up a straw man, and I didn't quite understand it. And so I then saw other people in the so-called intellectual dark web start to make the same connections. The intellectual dark web being the sort of emergence of these public intellectuals, often around the Joe Rogan podcast, which I've been on as well, who all started, Sam Harris, the Weinstein brothers, and others, and your colleague, Peter Boghossian, pinning postmodernism, or pinning social justice, the social justice terror, I'm going to call it, which I think is a pretty good phrase, by the way, on postmodernism. And they would even name, sometimes, Peterson would name Foucault and Derrida often. And I at that point, I gave up on anybody who was associated with him, the intellectual dark web, and especially their critique of postmodernism. Did not make sense whatsoever. I tried to engage them. Sam Harris has twice said he will not talk to me in public. So I haven't even bothered inviting him onto the show. Jordan Peterson, as I said, sort of dodged me. Gad Sad, another one of these people, I invited him, he wouldn't come on the show. So I gave up on all of them. And I also saw, and then you began, James, Helen, and Peter Boghossian, in 2017 is when okay, so you began what is now known as the Grievance Studies hoax, or Grievance Studies affair. And to me, it seemed at that time to be just another sort of reiteration of this idea that postmodernism is to blame for all the stupid stuff that's going on in college campuses. And I read pieces of it, and I can tell you sort of my criticisms of it still. But that's when I wrote the three of you off as well, and I just gave up on trying to engage the intellectual dark web on this question, and instead just teaching courses at Renegade University on what postmodernism is, doing debates with Stefan Molyneux at the Soho Forum that James was at, just putting out into public as much as I could what most people who actually read postmodernist texts believe them to say, and how that does not comport at all with what the intellectual dark web was claiming they said. So James approaches me at the Soho Forum, and I at first didn't want to talk to you because I thought, I didn't even know why you were approaching me.
To destroy you.
Yes. Which, in the internet culture, that's what we're supposed to do, right? In all caps, but it's always all caps.
It's always all caps.
That's going to be the headline of this, Thad Russell destroys anti-postmodernists. But actually what you started to tell me was that you and Helen had been doing very, very deep readings and extensive, maybe even comprehensive readings of the very texts I wished that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and the Weinstein brothers had been reading all along. You guys have done much more reading into all these texts than I've ever done. And you have concluded, you said, is this right? You concluded what I had been saying all along, which is that the connection between the original postmodern French philosophy texts and the politics and the discourse coming out of college campuses on the left in recent years is tenuous at best, or I would argue it's actually contradictory, and we can talk about that. But is that a fair summation of the history here?
So almost, by the way, it was the debate with Stephen Hicks. I don't want poor Stephen Hicks to get called Stefan Molyneux anywhere.
No. I debated Stefan Molyneux on his show, and then I debated
okay.
Stephen Hicks at the Soho Forum. But
definitely didn't go to a Stefan Molyneux event. Just to make that clear. No, anyway, I came up to you, and what I had said was I had actually heard you, in your debate, very clearly articulate that what's happening with social justice as a movement is not what postmodernism had originally said. And in fact, we could just draw example after example after example of places where somebody like Foucault would roll in his grave if that was a thing. So like, for example, the American Psychological Association naming traditional masculinity as a psychological problem. That was basically Foucault's, one of his, I don't want to say it was his whole point, but in one of his works, that was his whole point, or maybe a couple of his works. And so certainly something has gone off the rails. And so I approached you and said that there is a there, but it has mutated, it has changed. Something is very different. And that which is social justice now has heavy, I would say it's fair to say, stolen influences of postmodernism, that it has now turned to its own purposes, that if we had the postmodernists still alive, they would be criticizing it rather vigorously.
Yeah, I think I would take issue a little bit with the word tenuous, because I think there is a direct link between postmodernism and social justice scholarship.
I can name those links.
Yeah, we can. There's a lot of theorists, they all seem to write in 1989, where they literally said, we're going to take these aspects of postmodernism, but also add it to this kind of politicization. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They said it very clearly. But I think that direct link doesn't mean it's a faithful continuation. I've often said that the link between, well, I've spoken about Marxism and postmodernism, but if you look at, say, Judaism and Christianity, there's a direct link between Christianity and Judaism, but that doesn't mean that Jews accept Christianity as part of their foundation. So it's come on from there. It's these ideas, they're very specific: discourse, power, knowledge. They're taken directly, and Foucault and his concept of biopower is particularly prevalent, as is Derrida's hierarchical binaries. So they are taking them, but they've taken sort of meme versions and then they've made them user-friendly. And so the original postmodernists, of course, they wouldn't have approved of this. Lyotard himself said, you're not to take what we're saying as true. This is a question that we're asking. Judith Butler said, let's not define postmodernism in case it becomes a meta-narrative, and that's what it has become. And so, yeah, Derrida, Foucault, they would not be fans of social justice.
No. I think that's actually exactly what I said to you too, was that social justice had taken on it has a meta-narrative. And I think we even said it, the name of it is The Right Side of History.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, what I see on the social justice left is what it's called these days, or the identity politics. To me, identity politics is much more descriptive of what it is.
Yeah, I'll jump on that because it ties together what Helen just said, and it will justify using identity politics, which is when I said that I could name some of these links. Kimberly Crenshaw cannot be avoided because she's perhaps the most explicit. Her most famous paper is Mapping the Margins. The margins she describes at the very beginning of that paper, those margins are the margins of radical feminism, which she accused of being too white, and the margins of Black liberation thought, which she accused of being too male, and said that the point of intersectionality would be to kind of get them to criticize each other and then to apply that more broadly. And then at the end of that paper, so she I can almost quote it from memory, but I kind of always mix up a couple of words, but it's very close to that. Intersectionality is the provisional link between what she called contemporary politics, by which in context of the paper, she means identity politics. It is the provisional link between, so I'll say, identity politics and postmodern theory. So it's like, that's where the wagon was hitched to the horse right there.
Okay.
So definitely calling it identity politics. I would actually say that social justice is the fusion of the very specifically, when I say identity politics also, I mean the radical new left inheritors of Marcuse, which he also criticized as having become anti-intellectual and hooliganish. He criticized that in the mid-'70s before he died. He said that his own movement had just left intellectualism behind. So it's that style of identity politics that then started to make use of particular aspects of postmodern theory to basically make itself unfalsifiable.
If you'd like to take my course called What is Postmodernism, go to renegadeuniversity.com and become a member.
Okay, so you invoked Herbert Marcuse. I wrote an essay as an undergraduate on Marcuse, and I received an F on the paper because the professor did not agree with my politics. And he told me so. This is in 1987, by the way. But
he destroyed you.
Capital, yeah, all caps. He destroyed me. So the thing about Marcuse is that he is not really a postmodernist. He is okay, good.
No.
Well, I don't want to confuse the audience.
No. Yeah.
I want to thank you. I'm so glad you all said it's
no,
great.
He was a critical theorist.
Let me just pause and say something. It is a tremendous pleasure and relief, and I gotta say, to some extent, for me, a vindication to talk to two people who are critics of all of this stuff, who have actually read the stuff and know it. I mean, and I think you pretty much are the only ones on that side of this. So I want the audience to be very clear about these terms, these people, the categories, these particular intellectual movements. Marcuse precedes, basically, politically and his importance, what we're calling postmodernism, the postmodernist movement. Okay, so Marcuse is part of what's called the Frankfurt School. That's what he's been associated with. People like Adorno and Horkheimer, right? Now I will talk about what that is in a second, but for me, what we're calling social justice and identity politics now, that's the actual lineage. The lineage to me is to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is what informs, to me, most of what goes on in social justice. But
I actually agree with you.
Okay,
I don't so much.
And Helen doesn't quite so much.
Fantastic. No, that's great. So what I want to do, I want to hear, since you guys have actually read this stuff, and I don't, I'm in the wonderful and novel position of not having to explain to guests or the audience these texts and these intellectual movements. So why don't James tell me your reading? This is the Frankfurt School we're talking about, which really is the 1940s, 1950s, mostly
20s, 30s, 40s. So there's two eras of it, actually. There's the pre-war era, and then obviously the Nazis happened, and being that most of them were Jews, they couldn't keep hanging out in Frankfurt. So they absconded to Geneva briefly and then to New York City and took up literally in Columbia University. And so there's the pre-war era, and that would have been kind of Walter Benjamin, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer. They actually kind of got their inspiration and their start off of Georg Lukács, who had tried to start the Hungarian Revolution, communist revolution that didn't take. And so they had this whole idea, and what you were describing with the kind of how social justice hostilely took over the culture of college campuses. They had this idea called hegemony that they sort of focused on. They wanted to actually combine. They weren't Marxists anymore. They were what became called neo-Marxists. And what they were trying to do was take Marxian theory and combine it with kind of especially Freudian psychoanalysis, and then to also tie in like Weber's sociology and a number of other lines of thought, plus of course German idealism as a kind of continuous underlying theme. And they developed this whole philosophy that was essentially that they needed to criticize the culture to explain why people would, say, vote against their interests or support fascists or whatever else. And so they kind of came up with this idea that the elite in society were brainwashing everybody in society to go along with what was cool and good for the elite. Wouldn't have been coolness then, while kind of dumbing them down with popular culture as it emerged and keeping them docile and voting against their interests, but in the interests of the elite. So it was kind of a shift from economic analysis to cultural analysis in the same vein as Marx.
Right. The reason that working class people vote for Republicans like Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan is because they suffer from what the Frankfurt School theorists called false consciousness.
Correct.
They were not conscious of their actual needs. This is the most patronizing concept ever invented in the academy, in my view. It is the root of almost everything that I despise on the academic left. But that, to me, that's the core idea, right? Is that,
right.
And the false consciousness comes from, as you were saying, cultural hegemony, which is established by the capitalist ruling class, which owns the TV stations and the radio stations and the newspapers. And so, of course, this is their theory. So all they do is feed to the working class pro-capitalist right-wing, which doesn't make any sense either, but right-wing and conservative ideas. And the working class, implicitly, according to this theory, I don't know if they've ever said this directly, but implicitly, according to the Frankfurt School, is so stupid that they believe it.
Right.
Okay, this is Helen's shaking her head. I'll give you a second. You will get as much time as you want to destroy us. But that is my reading of the Frankfurt School, and I think it sounds like James's as well. Correct, James?
Yeah, that is my reading of the Frankfurt School, pre-war in particular, although it continued. Right. And It was very much this idea that, you know, as you said, there was this kind of brainwashing people to support elite interests. That I actually can't think of the Frankfurt School and not think of wannabe philosopher kings.
Yeah.
They were the philosophers. They knew better than everybody. And so they were going to set up what they called an ideal democracy through their criticism.
But this is why.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is why Adorno and Horkheimer and the rest of them, especially Adorno, hated and wrote extensively about things like jazz and Hollywood movies. They thought that popular culture was what was the chief vehicle for false consciousness, that it dumbed down the masses and made them susceptible to capitalist propaganda.
Right.
Right.
Post-war, that's where you get Marcuse's dominance. And then the whole thing kind of went into Jürgen Habermas and got a little fuzzy after that.
Yeah.
But Marcuse wanted to do something about it. So he has his book about tolerance. The most famous chapter is repressive tolerance. And that's sort of the tolerance idea that you hear now in social justice, is that to achieve a tolerant society, you have to stamp out everything that they consider intolerant, being intolerant of tolerance, and sort of a perversion actually of Popper's paradox of tolerance that Marcuse ran with.
Everyone listening right now should go read. It's short and it's easy to read. Go read Herbert Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance essay. Is that the formal title?
It's a chapter out of a book, yeah,
right.
Out of a longer book. It is an easy read. It's available for free online.
Yes,
you can read it, you know, in an hour or less easily.
Less, half an hour probably. It's very easy to read, and you will see in there, if you were at all sympathetic with our take on college politics right now, you will see, I believe, the origin of all this stuff. It is, to me, unalloyed, unabashed, straight up authoritarianism.
It starts out really good, I'll give you two. You read it and you're like, huh, yeah, okay, And then you kind of get a little further and you're like, that's off. And then there's it's like that discordant note. And then by the end, it's like, holy shit. You know, nothing short of it.
It's calling for the repression of speech, the repression of ideas straight out. I mean, Marcuse also called for a global revolution.
Right.
Essentially a socialist revolution. He didn't spell it out in detail, but this all began for him with the general strike and what he called the great refusal to participate in capitalism. He didn't go into detail like Leninists and Marxists have, but it was essentially calling for a global socialist revolution is how I read it. Okay, so now that all should sound to everybody a lot like what social justice warriors are saying these days, right?
But
go ahead, Helen. Now go and destroy us.
I think, you know, I don't altogether disagree with this, but I think there's a tendency that worries me of people to look at Marcuse and to see how similar he is to what is being said on campuses right now and think, well, that must be causal. But if you look at what the social justice scholars and activists are writing, they're not citing Marcuse. And I think where we have Derrida, and he wrote about the spectre of Marx. And in the spectre of Marx, he said how we wanted to kind of keep the spirit of Marxism, but he essentially denounced Marxism. So it was keeping this kind of spirit of revolution, of turning things upside down, but not going with the Marxist analysis. And I think that is what we are seeing, because Jim and I sort of friendly disagreements about this. And so I spoke to a Marcuse scholar who I think a lot of, and he agreed that, yeah, Marcuse is not directly being cited by social justice scholars and activists at the moment, but the spirit that we see in that kind of totalitarian, that kind of zealous spirit definitely does come down from that kind of attitude. Now, it's very difficult to measure a spirit, you know, so if you try and track the intellectual steps back, they're not showing a lot of Marcuse, but I know that I have been a little bit too prepared to be sort of bias towards Marxist ideas, and I get very frustrated when people are conflating Marxism and postmodernism. And although I don't, I'm not a Marxist, I have a bit more sympathy for Marxist ideas and for the idea of false consciousness than I do for postmodern ideas and the idea of discourses. Because yes, as you said, this false consciousness, it's very presumptuous. It's saying you don't know what's good for you. But for the Marxists, the solution to this was dialectic. It was conversation. They didn't believe that people who weren't as enlightened as them couldn't grasp it. They believed that arguments needed to be made. They believed that philosophy would solve this problem. Whereas when Foucault came along and he turned this idea of power upside down, whereas the Frankfurt School, you know, power is like a weight. It presses down on the proletariat from the wealthy classes, but for Foucault, power works through everybody. So at this stage, you cannot, it's much, much harder to see that you are being directed by these various discourses. It becomes even more pervasive, particularly in the social justice scholarship, and that is what they take. They don't take the Marcuse idea that people have a false consciousness and you can get them out of it by dialogue and dialectic. They take the Foucauldian idea that we are embedded in discourses which we accept unthinkingly as knowledge, and we repeat and perpetuate them. So that was a great long kind of ramble, but in that way, I do think the 2 points I'm trying to bring out here is there is not a direct line between Marcuse and social justice activists like there is between Foucault and social justice activists, but people who are picking up on that spirit, that radical revolutionary spirit of the Frankfurt School are not wrong.
That's where I think Crenshaw kind of, and this is the nature of Helen's and my ongoing debate about this topic. I think Crenshaw gives away the story where she talks at the beginning of mapping the margins. And if you don't want to read it in Crenshaw, the same things all through most of the Black feminists. So you can read, you know, Angela Davis, you can read it in Audre Lorde, you can read it in Patricia Collins, which she's more Foucauldian actually, but you can really get a sense of it in Bell Hooks. So you can start reading these kind of Black feminists who are informing Crenshaw, and then Crenshaw had these were people who were caught up in the Black liberation line of thought that was very radical, but the Black liberation line of thought was directly the most American aspect of the New Left, which is what Marcuse started. And so I don't think the link is actually that hard to draw. And so what you see with Crenshaw, and of course, Crenshaw's mentor is Derek Bell, who was a very critical scholar who was not postmodernist at all. What you see with Crenshaw is at the very beginning of mapping the margins, she tells you what the margins are. They're feminist thought that was quite radical, and it's Black liberation thought, which was quite radical. And these both have lines in some sense, less feminism, more Black liberationism.
I mean, what did Bell say about Marxism? Bell said, I'm sure Marxism has some good ideas, but I'm not interested in finding out what they do. So this is a kind of materialism, but it's not a direct link from Marxist scholarship. You can see this kind of class aspect that is similar to the radical thought, but there's no direct line there either.
Okay. So again, to make sure we're keeping the audience with us and clarifying all these terms.
Yeah, that got deep. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Another term that people hear thrown around all the time is critical theory. Critical theory. Now, for me, and in all of my studies and I've been in the academy professionally, meaning as a graduate student or a professor since 1991. Okay, so in critical theory, everybody was a critical theorist in the 90s. That was kind of the thing to be. That came out of the Frankfurt School to us, who used that term
specifically. Yeah.
Yep. But also, as what you were just talking about, in particular, its uses in regards to race and gender.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So critical race theory and gender theory generally were sort of lumped together under what we call critical theory. Okay. So gender studies departments now, what they teach, and African American studies department, what they generally tend to teach, those would be called critical. They'd be lumped under critical theory. Now that's, and also again, so that's to me the social justice discourse. That whole package right there. That's what I see coming out of college campuses. Is that fair, Helen? For critical theory for you?
I think it should be understood like that, but generally if I start talking about critical theories, defenders of the Frankfurt School will come up and they will tell me that what I'm saying isn't critical theory, it's postmodernism. And they will point out that the Frankfurt School is very critical, was critical of postmodernism, which of course Habermas particularly was. So I do think that's right, but because of this sometimes deliberate confusion, and I think there's I keep sending people a page from the philosophy encyclopedia, which says there are two meanings of critical theory. One, Frankfurt School. Two, critical theories more broadly, and that covers the identity and culture theories. But Jim came up with the term critical social justice, and I think
didn't come up with it. I didn't come up with it. I took it straight out of Robin DiAngelo's education book from 2012. She says from the very beginning, and I'm not exaggerating this. I could go grab the book and read it. You'll see I've quoted it 50 times.
Anybody who knows Robin DiAngelo will believe James.
She's the author of White Fragility also.
She is special. Go ahead.
She's a gem. She just says the silent part out loud every time, so clearly. But in that book, she says that many scholars and activists refer to it as social justice in order to try to reclaim its true commitments. That's very close to a quote. In order to reclaim its true commitments. However, we're going to focus on calling it critical social justice. And then she describes what that means about stratified societies and and then goes into the whole discussion of the Frankfurt School right after that. And then after she goes to the Frankfurt School, she goes straight to the critical methods of the postmodernists. And Foucault and Archaeology of Knowledge just says that when you study these things, you have to have a critical component that looks at how they are now and a genealogical component that looks how they were historically, looking for where the power is. And so the critical thing, I do agree that there's a narrow critical theory that's actually capital C, capital T, that was defined by Max Horkheimer in the book. Was it Traditional and Critical Theories or Critical and Traditional Theories? I get it backwards without looking it up, but it's one or the other. I think it's Traditional and Critical Theories. So the Frankfurt School had this idea that there were traditional theories, meme version, that really try to understand how a thing works. And then there's a critical theory that tries to describe the problematics in it and apply social activism to change it. That's the meme version. You can get into the details with Horkheimer. He's also not terribly hard to read. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a very, very good introduction to it in their critical theory page. Then there's this broader method of criticism, which Foucault definitely was drawing upon, because he explicitly says he was drawing upon it, where it's still this idea that you're looking for problematics. And my guess is that there's a straight line that you could draw from the Frankfurt School critical theory all the way to the social justice, except that there's this little line that kind of jutted off of it that informed the postmodernists. And I don't know the details of that jutting off line. And then what happened was in the 90s, that aspect, I would even say an unfairly perverted or highly specialized or applicable version of postmodern theory was taken up by these already spirit of or just directly critical activists. And they basically used it to give themselves like God armor that makes them impossible to argue with, because the second you argue with them, they can jump into, truth is all relative or subjective. It's all a matter of discourse. And now they can hide away from it. It's your truth versus my truth. Or they can get directly into we have to, maybe racism is less now, but historical injustices, which is going straight to a genealogy. So it's like they've given themselves kind of, supercharged tools that they've ripped off from the critical approach that was contained in postmodern thought as well. And I think that that's the most, I mean, I've really been trying to refine and change and even overturn that view for the past maybe 8 months or 9 months since I thought of it. And I just keep running into things that paint the picture more and more clearly that this seems to be what happened.
Okay. So let's go back to the history again. So the Frankfurt School emerges in the 1920s and 1930s, before the war, but it peaks in its influence after the war in the 1950s
Correct.
and 60s. This is when Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, and others get shipped over to the United States and start to train graduate students here who then become professors. So that is a whole generation of what we call the New Left. When we talk about the New Left, we talk about the left wing in the United States and I guess in Europe as well in the 1960s and early 1970s. And the New Left was very deeply influenced by the Frankfurt School, right?
Yes.
For that, okay. Then at that, so they, and then after the 60s, it sort of peaks in the 60s and then begins to fade away, but it remains in these remnants that we've been talking about. We'll get back to that in a second. But the people themselves, Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, either die or they just lose sort of like their prominence. But the ideas continue on for sure. Now, at that very same time in the 1960s, early 60s, is when Foucault and Derrida and the people we all call the proper postmodernists start to publish. So Foucault's first books were in the early 60s, as were, I think, Derrida's, right? And so you two have done a very an admirable amount of research, and this is some hard stuff to read. I don't think Foucault's that terrible. Sometimes he's difficult, but the rest of it, even for me, and I'm sympathetic to it, you know, I mean, Derrida is nearly incomprehensible. I actually, honestly, and I've said this publicly, so I'm not ashamed of it, my interpretation of Derrida is kind of a mix of like what I think I see in the text and what I hear experts say are in the text.
I think he'd be quite happy with that.
maybe, yeah. But Foucault,
another thing I've had contended, by the way, is that Derrida, because he relies so heavily in wordplay, and he's so sophisticated in his wordplay,
right,
and his intentional, like, exploring what wordplay does, that you cannot properly understand it without understanding it genuinely in his original French too.
That right. And his famous translator Gayatri Spivak was teaching at Columbia when I was a graduate student there too. She was like a walking deity there. But so I want to hear now from you two what you found when you went back, because when did you go back and start doing a really rigorous study of those postmodernist texts of the 60s and 70s? Just in the last couple years, or?
I mean, so Helen's background in it goes deeper because she was actually working in literature. My introduction to it would have only been after our papers came out, our fake papers. So this would have been very end of 2018. Is when I would have really, I mean, I had read some of them a little bit here and there, but no deep dive until after we got out of the grievance studies affair. So
first of all, tell us, like, what did you read specifically? Like, how much did you read? Which texts? Which philosopher? Where do you feel like you really have expertise that you could even, teach a college seminar?
On postmodern texts?
Yes, on postmodernist texts. Yes.
I would definitely say that I'm not qualified to teach a college seminar on any postmodern text.
Oh, yeah, you are. Oh, yeah.
I have read. I started with Foucault. I will admit, stumbled with Derrida. I read, of course, The Postmodern Condition. And I then started to read a lot of, I found it all very dense and very difficult. And I read a lot of what the experts say, as opposed to what they say themselves. And I tried to contact people who are experts, who are experts of people who are experts, which is what you get in these kind of, criticism, or everybody who's a critical theorist, it's like criticism 7 layers deep by the time you get to what you've read. So I started to do that. And of course, this is all very difficult because at the same time, I'm trying to read Robin DiAngelo and I'm trying to read Kimberly Crenshaw and I'm trying, so that Bell Hooks, there's so many different places in between. So that's why I say I don't know that I'm qualified to do a specific read of, or course on the postmodernists themselves.
But you've read the oeuvre, basically, of Foucault.
Yes, and yes, and then I have read, like I said, almost I don't know, an ungodly amount of the people who claim to be using his work.
Well,
I think
which is different. Now, how about you, Helen? What did you do in terms of the original postmodernist text? What did you read?
I focused on Lyotard and Baudrillard first of all when I was looking at the postmodern condition and language games and this idea of the hyperreal, which is really the understanding of an epoch of postmodernity, which was what Baudrillard and also Jameson were saying. Everything has become artificial and replicated and nothing is real anymore. So that's quite a pessimistic look at an epoch. Whereas then you've got Foucault and Derrida, who are sort of bringing out themes and theories from this, really embracing it and saying we have to be suspicious of all knowledge, have to look at how power is working in. But I think what Jim was saying, and it's true of me as well, because when I was looking at these texts for literature, I was looking at them in a different way. But we are, and I don't think it's wrong to say, we are primarily interested in what happened in 1989 when this became applied postmodernism. And so that's kind of working backwards. So I always say to everybody who wants to get a grasp of this that the best possible book they should read to get the understanding of it is the Fontana Postmodernism Reader. And the reason for that is that it was written in 1994. It gathers together all the main ideas of the postmodernists and then has a lot of the next generation of writers saying, what are we going to do with this? So we've got this idea of knowledge as constructed in discourses. We've got this idea of power knowledge and so all these sort of core ideas, but now let's simplify and bastardize them so you can really get a good understanding of how those sort of central ideas, which ideas survived, and solidified at the end of the 80s and went into the next wave of post-colonial theory, which obviously started a bit earlier, but then queer theory and critical race theory and intersectional feminism, fact studies, disability studies. It's a kind of amalgamation of all of their work. So I think, and I would agree with Jim when he says he's not qualified to teach postmodernism. I don't think I would be either, because I'm really very interested in these few concepts that have carried on. And so some things, like I even quite like Foucault's panopticon. I think that's actually quite a sound analysis. So, but I'm not so interested in that because it's not really gone on into social justice. The idea of power knowledge and anti-science and structures of power and privilege that need to be reversed, that's what's gone on, and that's what I'm more interested in.
Okay. But it has gone on, but because they're doing it.
Yeah.
I mean,
they're installing a panopticon.
That's exactly what I was gonna say. They want their own panopticon.
They can't put his analysis there because
Helen, you somewhat elided my question there. I want to know what your reading of the original texts in postmodernism say to you.
I remember mostly being extremely annoyed with Lyotard when he linked science with Christianity and Marxism as meta-narratives.
Okay, so lay out. I mean, I want you guys both to sort of summarize what you see as the major theories coming out of these thinkers. So go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
I would say, and I think it would be helpful as well to say how they changed things. So I think that the three big things that came out were, and they're all intertwined, of course, the idea that discourses control everything. It's the way we talk about things. We legitimize certain kinds of knowledge, and then they are disseminated, and everybody repeats them, just accepting that they are true. And we have to try and deconstruct these. So this is very much Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard. And then we've got this idea of knowledge as something that really is subjective. It isn't people often don't understand this, the idea of knowledge. It isn't that, say Foucault, for example, believed that we constructed reality itself, you know. So I've often said, when we thought that the sun went round the earth, the postmodernists wouldn't tell you that our thinking actually made it do that. But because we now say it doesn't, the sun doesn't go round the earth, because science shows us that the reality is that the earth goes round the sun, the postmodernists would say that's one model of knowledge. You're taking that model of knowledge, and so it is true for you that the sun goes round the earth. But if people create knowledge in a different way, such as the sun being a god that hides in a cave overnight, then there's no reason to say that that way of constructing knowledge is less worthy than the scientific one. But because we have all internalized the idea that science is great, the correspondence model of truth, the idea that what is true is what corresponds with reality, we now need to try and unthink that and to accept other ways of knowing. And so, of course, this all has this idea of that as it comes together, that power underlies all knowledge and is perpetuated in discourses. And if this is taken on to its logical conclusions in activism, as it was, then clearly the thing to do is to devalue dominant knowledges, raise up marginalized knowledges, control what people can say to make a better world.
Okay.
So, and this all happened very explicitly in 1989. I could just send you a list of people from all different disciplines suddenly saying, hang on, how about if we take these postmodern ideas, ditch the rest of them, and then make them politically actionable?
Sure. So I want you to stay away from post 89 for a second. Just stay with the 60s and 70s and early 80s just for now. And then I do absolutely want to go to that pivot. And I think you guys made a crucial discovery there that I was sort of unaware of, as a matter of fact. But let's just stay with the original text here. So I generally agree with what you said about, I mean, my take on the original text is very similar to what you just said. I don't disagree with what you said. There's more to it as well. But what I don't see, in particular in Foucault and Derrida, is much in the way of prescription.
No, I don't either. No, they're
Fantastic.
very descriptive.
Fantastic. Okay, right.
It's like
we've made that point in the book. They were quite aimless, and that's why they burnt themselves out. If you can't do anything, if you're just dismantling everything, at some point, you know, it's all in a mess on the floor, and you can't go anywhere.
Well, that's why it doesn't make much. That's one of the reasons it doesn't make much sense to link them to social justice warrior activists.
It does, in the sense that so many of them explicitly said, hang on, this is really, really good, but we can't do anything with it. How can we change postmodernism so that we can do something with it?
But that's the later people. That's the post-1980
right.
people. I'm talking about the original French guys. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
James,
but the social justice didn't exist then, obviously, so it's we can't really.
I know, but I want people to understand each of these intellectual movements discreetly, and then we can draw connections. So there's the Frankfurt School beforehand, up to the 1960s. Then the postmodernist movement begins in the 1960s, and then social justice emerges in the 90s and aughts, and especially in the 10s. Okay, James, do you want to add what? There's more to say. I really very, very much appreciated and agreed with Helen's interpretation.
Yeah, Helen did a good job. She's kind of left me like, what do I add?
There's more. I mean,
there is.
Just try to remember, like, what's your thumbnail summary of Foucault and Derrida?
Well, okay. So, I mean, Helen, I think, did a decent job with Foucault. Of course, he was very interested in potentialities and the way that one regime of truth might limit one's potentialities, potential ways of being, or potential ways of thinking, or potential ways of engaging with the world. And he wanted there to be kind of a liberation from that. His philosophy seemed to be very much about trying to find ways to liberate yourself from being, if you will, constrained by the truth, but where truth is understood as something to do with discourses, which he conceived as something to do with the way everybody talked about things. Derrida had a slightly different, from what I understand, a different understanding of discourses, a much more formal, almost linguistic, structuralist understanding of discourses, and was interested in how, I mean, the cheap way to say it is that language constructs reality, but it's more accurate to say the way that language, not in terms of how we necessarily use it, that would be more Foucault, but language in terms of how language is constructed itself, how words relate to one another as kind of like a web of concepts. Derrida was very concerned about how that shapes the way we think and constrains the way that we think. And again, deconstruction shows that there are absurdities contained within that, or contradictions contained within that, that can unlock, as he was, obviously famously concerned with the hierarchical binaries of power, man versus woman, or, I mean, it's more Foucault to go normal versus abnormal, but you kind of had, they did share space at the Sorbonne, so they did share ideas. They weren't actually like totally on board with each other, though. A lot of people don't seem to know that. It's like they disagreed with each other quite a lot. So Derrida was much more interested in the way that language is constructed itself. And so that's, he was very focused on language in particular. And it makes sense because his background really was coming out of the structuralism. And he's famously the post-structuralist, but he didn't call himself that, of course, that had kind of taken the previous structuralism of, Levi-Strauss, and which was derived off of the linguistics of Saussure, and just really dug into the way that there are absurdities and limitations on human thought contained within it. So again, you get this theme of trying to broaden the potentialities, or broaden the scope, so that you can remove oppression from the way that discourses, whether it's language as it's being used or language as it's structured, happen to be organized.
Go ahead, Helen.
Then, of course, you have, like Helen mentioned, I just get mad about Lyotard, so I try not to think too much about him. The skepticism of narratives, or meta-narratives, is really the core thing. His abuse of science, it's like having a background, but before I did math, I had a background in physics. And so I just kind of get that whole, like, science wars twitching eyelid when I read some of the puns he played, with a very scientific terminology. But I actually have become very interested again, and although I need to go back to it because my reading through like Baudrillard has been very superficial, I've become very interested in him, and to a degree Lyotard now, because I think we're seeing their descriptive projects, not prescriptive projects, bearing more fruit. Like I even kind of made fun of it in a recent thing I recorded for myself, that Lyotard and Baudrillard thought we lived in hyper reality or in the postmodern condition. And it's like, boys, you ain't seen nothing yet. wait until Donald J. Trump gets in office. We'll talk about some hyper reality, and
right.
Nothing is real. Alternative facts everywhere you turn. So it's like, I feel like that, they had a very descriptive project about how, obviously simulation and simulacra, you have the idea that everything's a copy, or everything is an artificial thing that takes you away from being able to have that real experience. So you get this connection, and you see it in all three, Derrida, Foucault, and in Baudrillard, where you have this disconnect, and there's this like alienation and feeling of dissatisfaction, where everybody's now disconnected from reality, from real, genuine, lived experience. And this shapes a subjective turn to kind of the whole original postmodern movement. It's like, we need to pay more attention to subjective aspects of whether it's knowledge or being and experience, and kind of get away from this modernist, you can almost picture it from like the old 1950s, science videos that we all had to, at some point watch about like the bombs or whatever from in school. And it's like, and today we have science and we can change everything. It's, that whole very, very modernism, logical positivist view that was so powerful. So there's this turn away from that hard look at hard acceptance of objectivity, and a broadening, if you want to say, of the potentialities of subjective experience showing up in kind of all of them.
Right. So now I would say, and I have said, and in my course on postmodernism at Renegade University, I lay this out. There are several French philosophers who either called themselves postmodernists or who are associated with postmodernism, who I believe are semi-Marxist in that their primary target of criticism is capitalism, right?
Like
and they are prescriptive. They prescribe, at least implicitly and sometimes explicitly, what Marcuse and the Frankfurt School people prescribed, which is a revolution to overthrow capitalism and replace it with something that maybe looks like socialism or something like that. They're not terribly detailed, but that is not, to me, that's not Foucault or Derrida. No. Foucault and Derrida had a handful of ideas about capitalism. It's even hard to find them in their work. They primarily, in fact, Foucault talked at one point about how he was primarily interested in the state, by the way. And that's why I've been telling libertarians for a long time that Foucault is your boy. Foucault's politics, if they're anything, are libertarian.
Quite a lot of people accused him of being conservative, didn't they?
Yeah, well, right, because they can serve.
Are you thinking of people like Deleuze with the capitalism critique?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even Lyotard, right, to some extent, and he's like they have this Frankfurt School concern about television, and pop culture in particular, right? They think it's bad, and they're also very elitist. Which
very elitist, yeah.
So I am
and
not.
You don't see that in Foucault or Derrida.
So those are not my guys. When I talk about postmodernism, I think that's if Jordan Peterson was talking about, which he often does, he talks about postmodernism smuggling in Marxism, right? I think he's correct when it's about those sort of more marginal or less famous postmodernist thinkers. That is going on, but it's not going on in the work, at least as I see it, of the two main most important ones, Foucault and Derrida. Fair?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, they in fact are described, not that we need to drag more, prefix-laden jargon in, but they're often described as post-Marxist.
Yes.
So they're disillusioned with Marxism. My characterization of them has been that they were very sympathetic to that view, became disillusioned with it, and because they, Marxism wasn't really up and positive on, although they were mostly in their work disinterested in it,
right.
To be fair. But except for specters of Marxism, obviously.
Right.
But the general idea is that they can't be big fans of capitalism, and they can't be big fans of kind of the whole liberal order of things that's got that whole modernist view, and that Marxism had been criticizing so vigorously. And then Marxism, they couldn't be that either. So that's where they just were like, kind of like, screw it, let's just do something completely different. And so I don't know how much of the spirit of Marxism comes through in either one of them, as Helen was describing earlier, but I do think that post-Marxist, in the same sense that it's like, we're moving away from that too, right. is the proper description for those guys.
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe that the best way to describe those more cultural theorists is that they weren't deconstructing capitalism as an economic system, but they were deconstructing liberalism and neoliberalism as an attitude of modernity. So I was thinking just then, because we're going to be losing a lot of people who don't know these thinkers, but I think the best way to understand the original postmodernists is to think in terms of two personality types, which don't really exist in a pure form. But you've got the modernists, and they think that that human thinking is too fluffy, that it's too vague, that we need to look at everything in sharp focus, we need to categorize it, we need to apply order to it, we need to understand it. So this would be the idealistic scientist who doesn't really exist. And the postmodernist is the absolute opposite of this. They think that we have already put everything in too many boxes, categorized it, shut it all down, prescribed ways to speak and think, and freedom comes from trying to break those down a bit, from trying to think outside them, from challenging them. So that is the postmodern attitude, really.
Thank you. That was a beautiful.
That was so good
summation, I think it's spot on in that it comports again with my reading of it, And
mine too.
And it helps me introduce a concept I wanted to bring up with you too, which is a concept that's very important to me, and it's been central in the academy since postmodernism emerged. Although I don't think the original postmodernists coined this term or used this term, but maybe they did. Essentialism. Okay, so essentialism. Can you talk about what that term means to you?
I think
first?
Spivak maybe coined that term, or maybe she didn't coin it, but she definitely used it a lot.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
She's hard to read too.
Yeah, but what's to me, this is maybe the most important contribution of postmodernism, is its attack on essentialism. It's its subversion of essentialism. Is that how you read it too?
I think you can see Foucault in there, because this idea of essentialism that really has come down from pre-modern times, when we have said, men are a certain way, women are a certain way, sex is meant to be a certain way, different races are a certain way. You've got this idea of the great chain of being, with God at the top, then the angels, then humans. So everything is in its order, and it's this idea that there isn't much variation. And then Foucault, of course, he argued that medieval ideas towards sexuality were essentialist in this way. Homosexuality was a horrible sin, but then so was science, because at the end of the 19th century, science regarded homosexuality as a disorder. So that's still essentializing what is normal and what is abnormal, and then trying to break that down trying to look at categories more fluidly. That was what the postmodernists were doing when they were deconstructing, when they were opposing essentialism, which of course the radical feminists did before them, and the liberal feminists. And my response to this would be that is good work. It is good work to challenge essentialism. The problem is that postmodernism isn't a good method for doing so. If we wanted to challenge things like scientific racism, gender roles, or sexuality, we have science. We know that the reality is such great human variation in the first place. Human nature is already fairly queer. It isn't really helped by people like Butler and Foucault trying to break things down in that kind of radically skeptical way that they did.
Okay, I liked your, again, description of essentialism. I think that's correct. It's the idea or belief that certain characteristics in human beings, or in things other than human beings, are set in nature or established by God. They are eternal, they are absolute, they are unchangeable, right? So if you're born a man, you're going to contain particular characteristics, you're going to behave in particular ways, you belong in particular spheres, and for women, same thing, right? And it goes for races as well. But did you not, one second here, sorry. Okay. But you say that the best way to challenge essentialism is not through postmodernist theory, but through science. And to that I say, well, who invented scientific racism? Scientists. Who invented?
And how do we?
Who invented the idea that women suffered from a nervous disorder known as neurasthenia, which made them incapable of operating in the public sphere? Scientists.
You're taking, what you are doing here, you see, is you're taking the earliest part. It wasn't that people said all races were equal and men and women were equal before science, but science then came in and took these assumptions that some races were inferior, that women were irrational, and they took it as a hypothesis, and they looked at it, and at some points they assumed it was true, and as science has developed, it has shown that it isn't true. So if you're looking at the work of science when it started addressing, and we must remember that a lot of these people we're talking about as scientists were social scientists, they were anthropologists, they weren't biologists as much, although there were as well. But yeah, these attacks on science, and this is where I really get most annoyed with Foucault, because he's looking at the end of the 19th century. This is when science first started to look at homosexuality and suggest maybe we shouldn't think of it as a sin, we should look at it as a disorder. The assumption is that it's a disorder, but as science has gone on looking at sexuality, it doesn't think that anymore. Minds have changed so fast since 1890 and now. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that this isn't anything to do with postmodernists. This is to do with scientists, biologists, and then liberals.
But it sounds like you have a belief in science. You have a belief that science will find the truth.
I think it's the best method for doing that. I think it's important that we're never sure that it has found it. I think the methods of science which never accept a hypothesis as proven, which try to falsify itself, is the way that we do best at getting closer to truth. But I accept that all of this could be an illusion. We could all be brains in a vat. None of you might actually exist. But I think, again, we're looking at this scale, and we've got our imaginary perfect scientist on one end and our imaginary pure postmodernist on the other. And both of them really believe that there is a reality out there, and both of them accept that we might not be able to get at it. The scientist is the person who will say, I accept these limitations and I will try to go forwards anyway and find what I can. And there's always this in the background, I may be wrong. Whereas the postmodernists will start with will stand in the fog of not knowing. That is what is satisfying to them. They don't necessarily want to know what is true. They want to know why we think certain things are true and how culture and power have affected that.
Yeah, that's where I am. What's wrong with that? Why not being the perpetual skeptic? To me, that's what postmodernism is in its distilled form, and the way I operate. It's perpetual skepticism.
Yeah, you have the luxury to do that, I think, because
Why?
Because of science. I mean, I know I have the luxury to study postmodernism because I didn't die in childbirth or of appendicitis. So I think it's postmodernism is a kind of luxury speculative belief, and I don't have a problem with people who want to do that. I don't understand it, but I think it's a part of human nature. I think it's a personality type. We see it in religion. We see it with the mystics. In religion, we see it in certain types of philosophy. It's not, I really think it's a kind of personality type, those people who want to order things and those people who want to challenge order. Okay. And we're probably stuck with that forever. But I think we need to kind of put them in their rightful places. I think postmodernism belongs with art and speculative philosophy, and science belongs with ordering society.
Have you both read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions?
I haven't.
Most of it, but not all of it. I did not finish it.
Oh, Helen, you haven't read the book. Oh
dear.
Very bad. This is why your ideas are not perfect yet.
I'll tell you though, I mean, before we jump on Kuhn, I'll tell you that when I read these kinds of, we'll characterize them. I don't know if it's unfair, but bear with me as like a cognitive placeholder. We'll characterize them as postmodern characterizations of science. Again, my background was in science, and so I can speak about a similar experience. So we'll do it a very postmodern way. We'll talk about my lived experience with it. And my lived experience of reading the postmodern criticisms of science, like Foucault's in particular, reminds me of being pissed off about science journalism. It's like, so the science journalists, and I recognize that, at the turn of the 19th century, we're actually talking about the scientists themselves being the ones. And then obviously many of them are going to be like, even today, policy advocates or policy advisors or whatever it is, so that they do use provisional knowledge to make policy that might not work out so well, or to make truth claims. But you see all the time, a scientific discovery of this sort or another sort happen, and then it's of course very provisional, and no scientist is like, the world has changed. But then the headline that shows up on like space.com, is asteroid to impact Earth, or some just absolutely cure for cancer found because it's some chemical that somebody discovered will eliminate certain types of cancers in certain mice cells under certain conditions or whatever. You get this really bad reporting. But that, of course, because when I think of science, I don't think of science as a set of conclusions. I think of science as a process and a way of thinking. And that may be because I was trained as a scientist before I got into being a mathematician and then whatever the hell I am now.
Right. So, Helen, I don't think you're going to be surprised by Kuhn's argument, and I think you probably will agree with it. So it may not even matter that you haven't read the book, but his argument is that if you look at the history of science, and in particular the history of scientific truth claims, you will see that they are constantly being overturned. And so he focuses in the book on the Copernican revolution, of course, and he's, one moment in history, not too long ago, really, if you look at the whole sweep of human history, it really wasn't that long ago. Everybody, all the scientists, all the wise men, all the clerics, all the government leaders, all the kings, everybody believed for sure that the sun revolved around the earth.
Yeah, but that's the important thing. Everybody believed it. If you could show me a thing where anybody claiming to be a scientist or recognizable as a scientist said, I have just done science and showed this, then that would be different, because what they've actually done, scientists mostly taken assumptions and worked with them. They've gone with them at first. Newton looked at alchemy. He was convinced alchemy worked.
Yeah, you're about to get Newtoned, though.
Oh, okay.
You're about to get destroyed by Newton.
Oh, no. But the progression of science. Go on then, just destroy me, Thad.
Oh, no, I think James said you were going to get destroyed by Newton, but Newton's not here to destroy you. I would say, no, what they used was a scientific method to determine that the sun revolved around the earth. They observed, right? Even with instruments, they observed this thing going from there to there every day. And they said, you know what? On top of that, we're going to predict that it's going to do the same thing tomorrow, which is what science is all about. The predictive power of science is what gives it credibility. That's why we believe in scientists. That's why they have power, because they can predict things, right? And so if you say it's because the sun is revolving around the earth, and you say, watch, it's going to happen again tomorrow at the same time, there you go. That looks really like a pretty solid theory that the sun revolves around the earth based on the use of scientific method. Okay, so then other people came along and they didn't have better telescopes, right? They just had a different theory. They just had they looked at the same thing, the same data, the same observations, and they just came up with a different theory. And then later we came up with telescopes that showed us all kinds of stuff. But even now, that's all being revised, right?
Yeah, and always will be.
Okay, well, So I had on my show a guy you may know about, Donald Hoffman, who's at UC Irvine. He's made the rounds on the Sam Harris podcast, and he's a cognitive neuroscientist. He is a scientist in the science building at UC Irvine, and he said to me on my podcast, no scientific theory, none, has ever been proven correct. Not as
they can't be. They cannot be.
That's
Fabulous.
the good thing about the scientific method. It has humility. There's this wonderful short sort of clip. Do you happen to know who it is, Jim? It's a Jewish physicist, and
there are a few of them.
I did. That doesn't narrow it down much.
He's standing at Auschwitz where his relatives were killed, and he was saying science didn't do this. Ideology did this. People who are certain that they are right about something do this kind of thing. Science is good because it isn't sure it's right. It won't allow itself to ever believe that it has got it right, and that is what is so valuable about it. It's not
Helen,
radical skepticism like postmodernism.
Stop, Helen. But you do.
I do what?
You believe that they have access to truth.
I believe no. I believe that science is the best way that we have currently of getting close to truth. But even that could be wrong. As I said, I could be a brain in a jar. I just don't think there is that much point in standing here in this undeniably true space where we can't actually know that anything is real, because then we'd really just starve to death and die. So I think Sokal and Brickmont put it well in their book when they said it could be true that there is no reality whatsoever, but it's a perfectly good hypothesis that there is. And if we carry on with the methods of science, we tend to get better results than if we go with faith-based ways of knowing or other ways of knowing. You know, in the modern period, since science has become dominant, you can see how infant mortality has decreased, and this is it's this kind of approach. I do not believe that science is correct and has all the answers, and neither do any scientists. It's postmodernists who tend to believe that scientists believe that they have all the answers.
Well, it's your okay. So 100 years ago, scientists believed that Black people were biologically inferior, that Jews were biologically inferior, that women were biologically incapable of doing all sorts of things that men could do, right? And then other scientists came along a few decades later and said, no, that's all wrong. Actually, all those people are biologically equal, right? How do we know that the current crop, the brand new crop of scientists are correct? To me, that's actually quite arrogant to think that
that's a difficult thing.
Don't do that. Don't assume that they're right, otherwise science stops. Science can only continue because it doesn't assume it's got it right.
Fantastic.
So I'm like backed up on like 6 things I got to jump in on with this now. So the first is that I think that what we're actually talking about is that science ultimately, and people are going to hiss, but I'm going to use this, I'm going to play a doubling game like the postmodernists like to do with language. And I'm going to say that science is also a deconstructive project. It is a type of skepticism. And so there are different degrees of skepticism. And so I would characterize when Helen was talking about, you know, the difference between postmodernists and the difference between science, my characterization would be that science is a more responsible method of deconstructing past falsehood.
More responsible. I don't like the word responsible.
Well,
well, you're a libertarian.
No, rights and responsibilities come married. That's an important thing. But nevertheless, it's more rigorous.
What do you mean? What do you mean by responsible? Seriously,
rigorous. Actually, it is a rigorous method. It is holding as an ideal, not claiming that it has. And I will tell you, I'm speaking better of science than it usually speaks of scientists, and they usually speak of themselves. Okay, I'm going to steel man science and many scientists' arguments. The ideal is objectivity. It's not that objectivity is actually something we have, but it is the ideal that's being held up, so that we are now going to bounce our concepts off of the least biased possible arbiter, which would be reality itself, because it's utterly impersonal. I remember I even got in an argument with a religious person one time who criticized me for saying that reality or the universe is impersonal because you have to be a person to be impersonal. And I was like, this is the stupidest thing. Anyway, reality doesn't have the capacity to care one way or the other about, it has no particular biases, right? Our biases are the thing that screw up our view of reality. So in the ideal of objectivity is to try to use whatever methods that we can devise to be as good as we can, and to continue to refine that process to defer to the objective standard that's out there as much as possible, to minimize the influences of our biases. So in that sense, I consider it a rigorous or a responsible method for overturning past knowledge.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to defend my postmodernists here.
Okay.
I have a quiz for the two of you.
Oh shit.
It's not really a quiz.
I've been day drinking.
I'm
just kidding. I haven't.
Thanks for respecting my show.
I have not been day drinking. It's okay. It'd be way more fun.
It's okay. I've been doing LSD. It's the only way I can understand this shit. What is Foucault's method for deconstructing or calling into question essentialist claims?
Well, he's
What does he do? What does he do to challenge or attack or subvert essentialist, absolutist truth claims? What does he do?
Well, in the sense of sexuality, he develops the concept of bio knowledge, and he deconstructs scientific discourses.
Bingo.
Yeah.
It's genealogy.
What's the title of his 3-volume work on sexuality?
The history of sexuality.
History.
Yeah.
The history.
And History of Madness also.
And his first books on the asylum and the prison, right, were history books. He writes the history of these ideas about insane people.
Yes, a historiography of them.
About homosexuals, about sexual deviance. He writes the history of it, and what he does is he shows that these ideas about these people, women, homosexuals, deviants, the mad, originated at a particular time, in a particular place, by particular people, for particular purposes. And then you look at it and you say,
this wasn't a novel thing, though.
No, I know. But that was
scientists knew that too. They also accept that.
Sure. So, but he writes. That's what he does. He goes back into history, and then he shows you that these things were invented. These ideas about women and black people and Jews and were invented by particular people for particular purposes at a particular time. They did not come from God. Yeah. They did not come from nature. They are not eternal or absolute. They just came out of the minds of people, human beings.
Right.
James.
Yeah.
I'm about to destroy you.
I'm about to destroy you back, so do it.
How on earth is that less rigorous than what you're calling for?
Well, besides the fact that, as Helen actually pointed out earlier, is that you start picking up here's a simple maxim. It's not always the case. We're not terribly foresighted individuals or peoples, if you will. And often you have to make the mistake before you can learn from it. And so you kind of do have to get things wrong, start to see the damage pile up, and then realize, oh shit, we better change course. For example, we see this with the pandemic right now, where they're like, oh, well, we don't need to close things down. We don't need to close things down. Oh my God, nobody can go to the park. We're going to arrest you if you're in the park because holy crap, you can't be left to your own devices. So it's, you often have to make the error to learn from the error. And I feel like the genealogical method is unfairly critical in many respects because it picks at the errors and the sequence of errors. So this is where I get to destroy you back, because we get to go back to what you brought up, which is Thomas Kuhn.
Okay.
And so Kuhn is actually the answer, because Kuhn actually does a better job with this, right? So history of scientific revolutions, what he talks about is paradigm shifts. That's what he refers to these as, right? Yep. So you have the current paradigm, which is maybe analogous to what, maybe you can answer the pronunciation question on this for me, what Foucault called episteme.
Yeah, either one. Episteme.
Okay, episteme. So maybe it's related to that. So you have this overarching, we'll call it a model of how the world works, right? And that it's paradigmatic. It tells you how you're going to think about the current questions, and you're going to think about the next questions. And eventually, all of a sudden, we're like, oh no. And then there's a new paradigm, right? And then things have to shift, and it's like, oh no, there's a new paradigm. So you can go from like the Copernican or the pre-Copernican model to the Copernican model. You can go from pre-Newtonian, if you even want to call them mechanics, because like it was just kind of, I don't know, ad hoc mechanics, to Newtonian mechanics, to Einsteinian mechanics. And now we're literally getting to the place where the Einstein versus Bohr, so the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and general relativity, are having some issues. They don't marry well at quantum gravity.
Right.
So there's no quantum theory of gravity anyway.
Right.
And there's some issues there. Right. And so what happens is, oh, there's a whole new paradigm, and then some more stuff happens, and there's a new paradigm, and everybody thinks differently. And that's the very postmodernist, very Foucauldian way to think about that. But that's not what happens in a paradigm shift. So this is why Kuhn destroys Foucault.
What?
Yep, because what actually happens is so let's use Newtonian mechanics. Newtonian mechanics are fabulous, right? And when you talk about everyday sizes and everyday speeds, I mean, we could go out, you and I, if we had a team of people who actually know what the hell they're doing, but you and I in principle could manage a team with Elon Musk of people who are going to send a rock or whatever we want to send to Jupiter, and we could time the rock's arrival correctly to within a few seconds using only Newtonian mechanics. It's a very powerful method.
Predictive power, you're talking
about. I mean, it models very accurately what will happen in reality. Yeah. To these macroscopic objects traveling close to ordinary speeds.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, we have to reckon with the fact that, say, our GPS wouldn't work off of Newtonian mechanics. In fact, our GPS and our phone would tell us that we are miles away from where we actually are within minutes if we put up the same system, but we didn't have a general relativity correction for the way that the universe actually operates put into it. Right. So there's obviously the cases that Newtonian mechanics is not correct. But there wasn't just Einstein came along and said, let's overturn everything and came up with this new idea. That's a very naive way to think about it. What happened was, as evidence kept piling up that Newtonian mechanics couldn't explain, the most famous thing being the perihelion of Mercury not behaving as predicted. So they even thought they came up with various hypotheses. What causes the perihelion of Mercury to not do what it's supposed to do? Of the precession, I should say, the precession of the perihelion of Mercury moved in a way that the Newtonian mechanics didn't predict. And they postulated that maybe there was another planet that was so close to the sun we couldn't see it. There's all different kinds of things that were within that paradigm, the Newtonian paradigm, to try to do it. You saw this much more famously with retrograde motion with Copernicus. And the retrograde motion of planets wasn't explained, so they had epicycles, by the perfectly circular orbit. So they put in epicycles, right. Then the epicycles had to have epicycles, and it's epicycles like all the way down. And then Copernicus comes along and says, let's just put the sun in the middle. And everything resolves, right? Kepler gets the elliptical motion. So what happens is there's a buildup of things that don't match. There's a buildup of stuff that can't be explained. And then some genius figures out, there is a more general model or a more correct model that completely subsumes the previous thing and corrects for these errors. That's what a paradigm shift genuinely looks like. And so I don't know what will resolve the tension between general relativity and quantum mechanics, but whatever it will be, because both general relativity and quantum mechanics confirm very, very, very accurately. Whatever it will be, we'll have to not throw either one of them out. It will have to somehow be a more general framework in which both are special cases. And that's what Newtonian mechanics is. It's a special case, slow and big, non-quantum, non-relativistic mechanics, and it's extremely accurate. So a paradigm shift is actually a new way of conceiving the model in it, like meta model, in the same way that meta narrative is, like the whole way that we think of the thing. And then the old thing is usually not, of course, with heliocentrism and geocentrism. The old thing is very frequently considered to be a special case of that. These are kind of the paradigm shifts in the Kuhnian sense that you start to see within the modern, and of course, Copernicus was like the beginning of science in the sense of modern science. So now you have like, science is a pretty evolved thing by now. So there's a book, and actually when you did your debate, we didn't have time to talk very long, and I wish we could have hooked up in New York again, but we were both busy when we were there last summer. There's a book, I don't know if you've read, that Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow wrote, called The Grand Design in 2012. I had the good fortune, I have never met Stephen Hawking, of course he's dead now, but I did have the good fortune to spend an evening with Leonard Mlodinow in 2015 and chatted with him about one of their philosophical ideas in that book, which I found to be, frankly, the most important takeaway. I think it resolves the whole Kuhnian thing completely. Okay. And they say that the proper philosophy of science that they've put forth is called model-dependent realism. So reality is real. We can know something about reality. We have to talk about what knowing means. That's realism. And then the way we know it is dependent on the model that we have. And this is actually, in a sense, a very postmodern friendly way to do it, but without postmodernism. So we have now a model of how gravity works. It's called general relativity. And it is very easy to describe exactly what will happen with extraordinary accuracy. With, our cell phones provide us with GPS. It definitely depends upon this. We have lots of reason to believe that we can trust that information when we try to put it into use. And it could be completely bogus in terms of hardcore truth. And so when you were asking Helen if she believes that science gets to the truth, the usual cop-out kind of thing to say is, well, it gets to provisional truths. Well, what is a provisional truth? A provisional truth is a statement about reality that we can reliably, if we bet on it, we can reliably win those bets. And so it's not some truth like in the metaphysical, absolute, or religious sense, you know, God decreed and therefore men and women are different because of some ribs or something. It's not that. What science in its much more matured form now, which isn't to say it's finished maturing, and it's not to say that we're in the correct paradigm, because we're not. There'll be more paradigms. But these paradigms are refinements of one another now that we're and I don't think this is, by the way, the case in social science. We should talk about that before too long. Physics is a nice, easy example because we know a shitload about physics now. Not everything, but a lot. We have this general trend toward being able to make more and more likely wins on our bets when we make statements about reality as science matures and progresses. So, and I think that model-dependent realism is a good way to think about it. And their argument, Mlodinow and Hawking, is that which model we use doesn't ultimately matter. So it's a very postmodern kind of thing to say. It's just that we all find a common language in that model, and the way we choose the model that we use is the one that predominantly that has the overwhelming most agreement and the most points, like the most accurate points of contact with describing behavior that we can make bets about reality upon and hope to win. So it's not a very satisfying thing for your average person to say, well, this is how it is. But I think that that's actually the kind of, and I'll give credit to postmodernism, because postmodernism obviously shook this stuff up, and then Kuhn's work was obviously, it's tied tightly into that. And this is, as I just said, it's got a very postmodern flavor to it, that we're going to accept that the model is a social construct, but we're also going to accept that the model actually does describe reality really well. And so we're going to agree until we have reason to switch to operate within this model, realizing that it's going to be broken around the edges. Now, before I know you probably want to destroy me again, but before we go there, let me just jump in, and I want to actually point out that social science, which is where we get more relevant with this social stuff, the stuff that postmodernists were more interested in, homosexuality, for example, even. Yeah. Social science is still very much in its infancy compared to physics, very much in its infancy. And so when I said that Foucault was describing the faltering steps and errors that were being made by science, which were in many cases very badly consequential, in some cases outright egregious, he's describing those faltering steps. I think that we haven't taken very many faltering steps away from the beginning in social science. We're still we still don't know what the hell is going on. We're in the middle of a replication crisis because we don't even really have a real social science yet. There are good methods that are developed, some, but everything there is so freaking provisional that it's all got to be taken with way more grains of salt than our good friends, the science journalists and pundits, will allow us to do. And so I do see room actually for that postmodern, not necessarily, I do like the genealogy actually for reminding us to be humble.
Okay.
I very much do. I don't think that using the word science is going to be fair, because whatever physics is doing and whatever chemistry is doing, and even to a great degree whatever biology is doing, is somehow a world away from what anthropology and sociology and psychology are doing. There's a big gulf between the so-called hard sciences and the so-called soft sciences in terms of their maturity. When you are talking about a more mature science, when you just say science gets it wrong,
nope.
No, not when it's physics. I know, but that's you didn't do that. I'm sorry. That's what a lot of people who kind of pick up kind of a pop postmodern worldview do say, though, is that science is just one way of knowing it. That's very common, in fact, with our friends today in the social justice world. Science is just one way of knowing. Literally, the science must fall movement in South Africa is let's replace science with literal witchcraft. It's just because it's just one way of knowing. There's a lot of baby in the bathwater that might get thrown out there.
I see.
That's very concerning there. So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So the harder sciences, I mean, does it really does it really matter if what a proton really isn't really a proton? It's got to be called some other thing in a more complicated quantum model.
Okay.
Who cares? But then when you start talking about, is transgenderism a mental illness? Right. That's some fuzzy stuff, right? So the call for humility there that's in postmodernism, I think, is actually the Foucauldian genealogy. That call to humility, I think, is actually a valuable thing. But I don't think it has to be quite so cynically presented in order to deliver the goods.
Okay.
And I know I disagreed with you in the debate about when you started talking about nuclear weapons, because that was politicians. That was generals. Scientists just made the damn thing.
Good point. Excellent point.
And they were right, by the way, that if you put uranium like that and you put a detonator around it, it will blow the fuck up.
You're right. That was a bad example. How's maybe a better one? So scientists invented the idea, again, of scientific racism, okay?
Right.
And they also invented penicillin, which, right, that's what you're getting at, which we were very happy to have, right?
Sure.
So are you saying that to call into question science generally and its access to truth, as many postmodernists do, there's a danger of throwing out the penicillin?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I just read yesterday that there's a movement to put indigenous health stuff, like by law, into Canadian healthcare, which is bad right now.
Sure. So I would say, sure, you could read Foucault and from that decide, yes, that because there is no absolute truth ever established by science, that we may as well just replace it with any old belief system.
Sure.
That's okay, wait, Helen, I will, just one second. However, guys, you know this, and we've already agreed on this, Foucault never said any such thing. He never prescribed any of that. He simply said what scientists like you and Kuhn and Donald Hoffman, who I mentioned earlier, and many others have said all along, which is that it's never proven anything. It's never proven anything, and we must be skeptical and we must be humble. So
sure.
I've had another.
But it has proven things to like 6 sigma and 8 sigma and 10 sigma.
Well, but again, it never proves the cause of anything. You can never show tangibly the cause of one thing. You can never do that, right? It's never been shown that is what is happening, that this dropping is gravity, that's actually happening. You can't show that.
Sure.
Okay.
Gravity is the model.
Okay. Helen, you go.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to go on from that to say that you talk about the use of Foucault in fat studies, and there's a very, very strong.
You said fat studies, FAT. Just
yes.
In case people missed that, because a lot of people don't know how silly a lot of academic stuff is, and I agree with you.
It draws on queer theory hugely. The theorists that they use the accurate. Criticism to say that because we once thought homosexuality was a disorder and now we don't, it must also be true that our belief that morbid obesity is a health problem is also untrue. And that, I think, is one of the most dangerous aspects of the way in which Foucault's thought has been taken. And I know that you are a fan of Foucault and will defend him, and yet he can be defended against the use of him in fat studies. But his work is what has been used to undermine quite a lot of the productive stuff in science. And I think it's Alan Sokal and John Brickman again who usefully divide skepticism into radical and specific. So whereas science has specific skepticism, when it must say about everything, how am I sure this is true? How can I prove that this isn't true? And tries to do that to get gradually less wrong. Postmodernism, I think, has a lazier approach in that its overriding thing is, well, we can't know anything anyway, and so what's interesting is how culture works. And I actually agree with them with that. I've just been listening to Jim and I haven't understood a word that he said about physics, and I don't like science. I find science extremely boring. I am interested in culture and discourses.
Right, me too.
And this is why I have studied postmodernism solidly for 7 years, even though I'm not I don't believe it has worth. So I think, you know, we have to, I think that I keep saying we need to put things in the right place where they are. There is grounds for those of us who want to study culture and who want to study the ways people are talking about things. What Jim and I are doing very much at the moment is trying to dismantle a dominant discourse known as social justice. Now that's postmodern, if you like, but we're not doing it in this radically skeptical way. We're not saying this is bad because it's a meta-narrative and meta-narratives are bad, so let's pull it apart and try and find the aporia. We are looking at and making arguments for what is specifically wrong with it, that it isn't evidence-based, that it isn't ethical in various ways, that it isn't consistent liberally.
Okay, great. So that's great transition. So let's finish by talking. Let's describe now this third intellectual movement. We've done the Frankfurt School, postmodernism, and now this thing we're calling social justice. And on this, we're probably going to agree mostly. But let's just describe it. You guys describe it, and you've done sort of a taxonomy of social justice as an ideology, right? And politics. So why don't you both just describe what's being said, what it is, how it works as a system of thought, all of that. Go ahead.
Jim, do you think we can talk about the how we divided it up in the book, as the book hasn't been published yet?
Yeah, I mean, we can. It's not a huge deal. It will lure people to read the book and see how we use those ideas. So
your book. Tell them about the book and when it's coming out.
Yeah, the book's Cynical Theories, and it's hopefully coming out in August, but it's going to be post-pandemic, so it might get pushed back further. And in that we go through with a chapter on postmodernism and then the theories that have devised from it. And so we pulled out two principles: the postmodern knowledge principle, that knowledge cannot be gained objectively, that everything is mediated through culture, and the postmodern political principle, that society is structured in systems of power and privilege, which create discourses, which create the knowledge that we all work by. So that comes very much from the postmodern ideas. Okay. And then we have the categories of the blurring of boundaries, where they want to break down all the categories. We have cultural relativism, where there's we're just morally relative in relation to culture. There's the focus on language, intense neurotic focus on language as the constructor of reality and the thing that needs to be policed.
Did you say intense neurotic focus?
Yes. Yes, that may not be charitable, but
that's an ad hominem slur against me and my people. But go ahead, continue.
And then there's the rejection of individuality and universality, the dividing of people into collectives positioned by their identity into these systems of power. So we see this coming in around 1989. A lot of essays got written talking about how they wanted to take these ideas of cultural constructs, discourses, knowledge and power from the postmodernists, but that they couldn't use them as they were because they weren't prescriptive, they were descriptive. And there was a lot of talk about how the postmodernists could afford to be descriptive, and it was because they were white, wealthy Western men, and they didn't really.
And they were professors, in their ivory tower, not the struggling people in the streets, right?
Well, it was professors that said this as well, so they didn't mention that bit.
No,
but
right.
But, and they wanted to make it more politically actionable. So you have people like Mary Poovey, and she says, well, let's use these deconstructive techniques, but we have to accept that women are oppressed consistently in the same way, so that objective reality exists. Right. And then Judith Butler, who really disagreed intensely with Mary Poovey and said, we don't have to accept that women is actually a stable category experiencing stable oppression at all. We can look much more fluidly at sex and gender, and deconstructive techniques are great for this. And then we had Kimberly Crenshaw, who Jim has already described. She critiqued both liberalism and postmodernism and said how they needed to be adapted to her new contemporary politics applied to postmodern theory. And so we've got suddenly this turn from describe what is happening, challenge it, question it, break it down, see how it works, look at what cultural factors and power relations were at play in it, to reconstructing. So we need now to really associate knowledge with identity. There's Black people's knowledge, there's women's knowledge, there's trans people's knowledge, and these need to be raised up and elevated, while the knowledge of white Western men needs to be devalued. And unfortunately, this includes science, it includes reason, it includes Christianity and Marxism to a certain extent, which some people might like. But yeah, it also really undermines the whole concept of research in the first place. There's this idea now of research justice, in which to adequately research a topic, you need not only empirical data and analytic processes to look at it, you also need things like religious beliefs, lived experience, customs, tradition, to try and bring it in all together. Now, you might think that some of this sounds great, but what the biggest ethical problem with it, I think, is the claim that goes along with it, in which women and non-white people aren't really suited to science and reason and rigorous scholarship. That's a problem. We're much more about feelings and emotion and experience. And so we've got this sort of perpetuation of Orientalism, really, when we're saying science belongs to white West men and they have this wonderful other knowledge with magic. Isn't it great? It's really quite obnoxious, as is the idea that women's knowledge isn't scientific or reason-based either. But
let me rescue your postmodernists here too, because I saw you kind of shake a little bit. When Helen said that there's this focus on the group rather than individual or universal, and you kind of, you agreed with us up to then. Your original postmodernists did not look at identity this way. They looked at historical contingency and culture at a particular time and place. These new social justice people who actually were bringing in the, as I would phrase it, and I know Helen and I have some disagreement still about this, it's these Frankfurt School style critical theorists who brought in the focus on identity in particular and then fused it in. So your Foucault was not saying, oh, different races have different knowledge. He was saying that different cultural groups at different times in different locations in both time and space had their own systems of what they considered to be knowledge. So he didn't ever appeal straight to what is in the literature now called racial knowledge.
Right.
But the people who talk about racial knowledge say they got that idea from reading Foucault. So it's, I would say, a perversion of his actual thought, with the critical mindset being the operative element that has come in.
Thank you. Yes. By the way, the cultural relativism piece that Helen mentioned, and you sort of mentioned this now, I mean, that comes from Margaret Mead and cultural anthropology before World War II. The Franz Boas School of Anthropology at Columbia, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Franz Boas, these people are the ones who invented this term, cultural relativism, and they're the ones who introduced the concept that no one culture is absolutely superior to another, right?
This is the important thing that I think we need to make the point of. Absolutely nothing in postmodernism is new. It's not that nobody before ever thought that knowledge might be a construct of culture, or that categories, but quite often postmodernists come along and they say to you, but you're embedded in this logical positivist world where you think that everything in your society is all perfect and you haven't learned to think outside it, and we need to teach you how to deconstruct it. And then from this, in later generations, comes the word woke, because you're now able to see these discourses and systems of power and privilege. And really, there's a long skeptical and relativist, there's a long skeptical tradition in modernity, in scientists. There's a long,
it goes back to ancient Athens. It goes to, it's the sophists and the skeptics and Nietzsche, in the 19th century, and
the mystics. I think sometimes Foucault is best understood if you relate him to Augustine. So you know how huge an impact Augustine has had on the West, because he merged philosophy and Christianity at once. And then you have got people who read him, and they've taken his words on in so many ways. So we have Catholics and Protestants both citing Augustine, both translating him differently, because he's got that kind of power for concepts to be plucked out of their context and used in other ones. And I think this is what we are seeing with Foucault, and I think it's down to us whether we either allow the ideas of knowledge, discourse, and power to carry on this sort of Foucauldian kind of spiral and disintegration, or we try and rein it in a bit.
Okay. Has anyone been destroyed yet? I'm not sure.
I think we've all destroyed everything. No, generally, I think Ben Shapiro is the only person who's been destroyed.
That's I thought he was the destroyer of others.
I mean, that's why, right? It's
right,
like I get in trouble every time I mention his name. Like, it automatically means I'm like his biggest fan because I said his name or something like that.
I kind of like him, actually, but but he wouldn't like me. So I think we've done some very good work here, and I think there's some agreement, broad agreement on certain things. I think Helen is less comfortable with certain elements of the postmodernist way of thinking than I am, but that's fine. But I think simply decoupling the French philosophers of the 60s and 70s from these kids with blue hair on the Oberlin campus now is kind of like enough for me. Like, as long as we can end this idiocy that's being peddled by people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and others in the intellectual dark web, that they are the one and the same. And also Marxism, they also conflate that too, as we mentioned earlier. If postmodernism is the same as Marxism, is the same as yelling that I'm trans and therefore I am this, and this, and you're not trans and that means you're this, which is essentialism. Social justice is an essentialist worldview.
Very essentialist.
Identity politics is almost by definition essentialist, right?
It's kind of the irony of it is that they're doing essentialism in the name of anti-essentialism. Spivak called it strategic essentialism, but it's called something similar. She didn't call that strategic.
They'd argue, though, that they're not essentializing. What they're saying is that people in certain positions have certain experiences. It's not something essential about their nature. It's just that if you are a woman, discourses around sex mean that you're going to be treated as less competent, more emotional, and you'll all have that common experience, but it isn't true.
No, that's the sidestep.
No, it's actually, believe it or not, you're actually, it's worse than that. No, if you look at Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? The most famous identity politics peddler out there, his book and all of his writings and all of his talks in the last 5 years have said what about white supremacy? How long will it last? Forever.
It's permanent. Yeah, racism is permanent. They do believe that.
That's the definition of essentialism, right? That white people will always be racist, that black people will always be their victims. That is essentialism par excellence, and Foucault would vomit in his grave. Correct?
Yeah, although they would say that they believed that it was a permanent aspect of culture, not something in white people's brains or hormones or something.
Well, to say that it's will always be here, that's I don't know how that cannot be a biological claim, right? That's a scientific claim.
I mean, you've seen that. I mean, I think quite a lot of us have seen the video of the black activist shouting, "It's in your DNA," which is an essentialist claim.
That's essentialist for sure, yeah.
Right.
But the social justice activists would say, no, it's because of how culture is constructed. If it had been constructed the other way around and white people were seen as inferior, then that would get stuck as well. It isn't any difference in brains or biology.
But again, it's an essentialist take on culture, right?
It's spiritually essentialist. I think you said it right when you hit that. I mean, this thing is very much a faith. You see lots of people trying to compare it to like some, I don't know, evolved is the wrong word, but something that means something like that, Calvinism. And the Calvinists are the only people who kind of freak out and they're like, no, it's not us. But
Spiritual essentialism. I just coined this. God, that's good. Yes.
I mean, it really is. That's the level that it works on, because they're fundamentally mostly not entirely anti-real. They just care about kind of the abstract world, and everything is in these kind of non-real, but they call them realities anyway, systems of power. The oppression that the systems of power create is the real thing. So it's almost anti-real, but it's almost like the Cartesian. I mean, we've said this a few times before. It's almost like the Cartesian, struggle. And he comes up with, I think, therefore I am. So he knows that there must be some form of being. And here it's, I'm oppressed, therefore I am. It's that oppression being real is kind of like the rock of this worldview. And then from there, I mean, Descartes was very spiritual. And so he was like, well, if I think, and somehow he gets to God from that, which is quite the leap. But from here, it's like, oh, well, it's not even that big of a leap. It's like, well, how am I oppressed? And it's not, especially given like, not even post-civil rights. I don't want to go back to like the 70s, which weren't exactly racially happy in the US. At least since, this millennium, it is not like it was, and is blatantly not like it was, which is why you see all these books coming out like 2004 through 8 titled The New Racism, which is like why there's still racism even though there's not racism. They call it cultural racism, actually, and which means that white people don't like black culture as much. So it's the leap is to systems of power, and these mysterious systems of power are by definition self-perpetuating and self-legitimizing, and they, back to our false consciousness, induce this sense people with privilege have the privilege of not knowing they have privilege. Hence, check your privilege as such kind of a declaration within this worldview.
They think
it's like a depravity kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. They think of things like sexism and racism as spirits.
Yes.
That hover above the earth and wreak havoc in various ways across time.
Right, which is why, by the way,
and across space.
Which is why you can't have any bad thing happen. Right? Nothing bad, because I don't want to say one drop, because that means something else, but one example of a thing isn't some asshole being a racist or a sexist or a jerk or whatever. It is actually he's like the boil that came up because you have measles. And the measles is the systemic disease. The racism is through the whole system. And the fact that he was even able to have racist thoughts is the fault of the system being corrupted, which is why you'll see things like, what was the statistic I just saw recently? Of some kind of one of these bigotry-based incidents that occurred, and then the proportion of it was like 0.00013%, and it was described in whatever it was written about as a crisis.
Right.
But it's a crisis that it happens at all, because if it happens at all, that means the system enables it to be able to happen. And as Helen was trying to say before I spoke over, the system is actually, this is where they've stolen from the postmodernists against the system of discourses, in addition to stealing from the critical theorists, which is the system of institutions. Right. So your institutional problem and your cultural problem.
But this, just so I want to hammer this again, and then I want to just ask you one last question. So, I mean, this spiritual essentialism that we're calling it among social justice warriors and in identity politics is anathema, correct, to Foucault's thinking and Derrida's thinking?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you. Now,
they would tear it apart.
Great. Okay, just stop there. So here's my no, Helen, I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to let you.
You're not going to let me qualify anything.
I'm not going to let you mess up that beautiful golden moment of togetherness we had there. Well, go ahead. No, go
this
ahead.
Is the patriarchy, Helen. Shut up.
Yeah. I have you on the bottom of the screen for a reason here. We're on the top. No, go ahead. What do you want?
I think this is right, that they've taken the idea of the postmodern idea of discourses, but they've taken them as objectively true. So one of the anti-racist slogans is, the question is not did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in this situation? So they've started with their conclusion, then they read a situation and find a way in which it was racist. So there's an objective truth claim there. And if you search Robin DiAngelo's books for language like certainly, absolutely, can't deny, facts, then you will find them all over it in a way that really would traumatize Michel Foucault.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now, here's the last question. Have you talked to Jordan Peterson about this?
No, he's sick.
Have you talked?
Well, we talked a little bit to him. What was it? Over a year ago now, right? We had a conversation with him. Helen and Peter and I did.
Okay.
I did raise the thing with Marxism and postmodernism with him, and I said that I thought Marxism was the totalitarianism, while the danger of postmodernism was more fragmentation. And he didn't disagree. He just nodded, and then I have seen him a couple of times say that, yeah, on a theoretical level, Marxism and postmodernism are not the same. But
right. I've seen him say that too. Yeah. And have you talked to any of the other stars, the intellectual dark web, to inform them that they are completely wrong about postmodernism?
I mean,
I don't know what most of the ideas are, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, who are these? I mean, I don't have a relationship with anybody anymore, but certainly if you want, Peter understands these things much more the way that we do now, because I speak with Peter fairly frequently. Okay. I've never had the opportunity to speak to Sam Harris about it, so I can't say that I've spoken to him, for example, if we were to name individuals. In fact, I don't speak to hardly anybody anymore. I mostly just read a bunch of shit and write it down in my encyclopedia. But I would very much like to disambiguate these ideas. Yeah. I feel like one of the reasons that the social justice phenomenon, or we should really call it the critical social justice phenomenon, is so adept at not getting taken down, is because, and it very much deserves to, it's like, it should be one of the easiest things to criticize, is that it's not necessarily that it's so difficult. I just don't think anybody's really done it, except possibly a handful of us who are all on a Zoom right now. Everybody who criticizes it, they're able to so easily say, you don't have it right. So the intellectual dark web, obviously, if you will, launched a massive assault on it. And it was just so easy for them to say, you don't even know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. So I would very much like to empower anybody who wants to take the problem on to understand it correctly. And I would also actually like to say that postmodernism is proper old school postmodernism is full of wonderfully useful tools for taking this stuff down, as it turns out. So
we are acting deconstructively on this new meta narrative.
That's right. I would just hope that you would get the ear of some of these people so that they can stop trashing some texts that I think are actually quite useful, and in some cases, to me, highly liberatory for everybody.
Well, I mean,
I
as
wish
soon as I can, I will.
When you see something like this happening, do send it to me, because I don't know what most people's ideas are about it. I don't see that many people talking about postmodernism more than very superficially. And I think there's a tendency for a few people, quite cynically, to conflate a lot of ideas on the left that they don't like under the term postmodern neo-Marxism. But there's also, if we're going to be more charitable and more generous, there's a tendency for people not to understand what is going on, this whole idea to be so counterintuitive. And if someone comes along and says, well, it's Marxism applied to culture, and we call that postmodernism, you know, that people grasp it because they can understand it. It isn't that they're motivated to conflate and confuse too many things. It just isn't something you can pick up quickly. The nuances aren't.
Well, I want to thank you both for doing a lot of very difficult reading. Very difficult reading. I want to thank you both for finding in it essentially what I find in it, and for identifying this problem in our current discourse, the popular discourse about this evil specter known as postmodernism. And I mostly want to thank you for coming on and talking to me, because these other people will not talk to me. So it's great to
That's too bad.
What's that?
I said that's too bad. I mean, I really,
Yeah. Well,
I
whatever.
would like to see more people get more correct about it. And my vibe is that a lot of people are trying to right now. There's something of a renaissance of interest.
Yes.
And I get somebody email me every couple of days now. I'm reading Foucault for the first time. And is this what I'm seeing?
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for all that you've done. And thanks for coming on the show. And, I think we should talk later about doing some other things together, either at Renegade University or Unregistered or something, because I think this can be a very fruitful relationship among the three.
I think so too.
Cool.
I would enjoy
Thanks
that.
very much.
Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To take my course on postmodernism or become a member of Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. Thanks for listening.